Hi, everyone. Thank you guys for staying for this last panel. It is cold, but we appreciate it. Okay, I'm really excited to introduce my co-panelists today. So I'm sure that most of you guys know Connor Franta, but
Hello.
even though he needs no introduction, Connor Franta is a social media personality, an author, an entrepreneur, and an all-around badass. His new book, Note to Self, is out April 18th. We're really excited for that. We also have Reina. Reina, for the past decade, has been a community organizer working with low-income people and queer people of color. More recently, she's entered the art space, working on films that enforce positive representation of marginalized people on screen. Thank you for being with us. And last but not least, we have Grace Dunham. Grace is a writer and activist who's working right now on a crowdfunding platform called Support FM, which raises bail and bond money for trans and gender non-conforming people. Thank you. So obviously you guys know that the point of this panel is basically about how you can exist as an out and proud queer, gender non-conforming, transgender person in Donald Trump's America. And basically, I think, after the election, a lot of people were very rightfully concerned about where Trump was going to take the legislation in this country, whether that was affecting transgender people, the LGBTQ rights in general. So I wanted to get everyone together to talk today, especially because there's legislation that's advancing right now that we should all be aware of. But to start off, I was reading in People that Grace and Reina, you guys had this kind of amazing meeting that had informed how Grace, how you come to look at yourself. I was wondering if you guys wanted to talk with us about that experience and what came of it and how you guys met.
Well, I can't speak for Reina, it was definitely impactful for me. I think it's more broadly just has to do with the fact that I don't know who I would be if it wasn't for friendships that have opened up new possibilities to me. Like every time I jump into, I think, a more honest or brave or courageous version of myself, or kind of like take the risk of saying, this is who I am, this is how I want to be, this is how I want people to treat me, it's usually because there's someone who I love who kind of sees that I have the potential to be that maybe even before I do. So I definitely had that when I met Reina, which was when I was, at this point, well, it really wasn't that long ago. It was like 2 years ago. And I think just what the feeling of becoming close to someone, whether it's a friend or a lover or a teacher or whatever, who says to you, who gives you permission to be a version of yourself that you haven't been given permission to be before, that's like the most powerful thing.
I think one of the things I think about when I think about our friendship is how urgent and necessary it is for queer people, young people, transgender, non-conforming people to have people to reflect them back, right? We live in a world where if you're trans, if you're queer, if you're a young person, if you're a person of color or disabled, so often who we are isn't reflected back to us. Like so often we can move through the world and never see any kind of representation of ourselves. And I think that means that those kinds of intimate friendships are that much more important.
And oftentimes friendship is the first space that we have that.
Yeah, exactly.
And Grace, can you tell us a little bit, because you had to deal with a lot of your coming to terms with your identity has happened on quite a public stage. So can you tell us a little bit about your journey and how it's gone for you and what it's like having to do that somewhat in the spotlight?
Well, I would say first off, I definitely didn't consent to that. So it's not an experience that I identify with. I think some people in the first panel, we got to hear from Rowan and Yara, both of whom are these amazing artists and creators who it seems like are really thinking strategically and critically and with so much integrity about what it means to be a young person in the public eye. And I think it's so cool that people have role models like them and can look to people who are dealing with the public, who are thinking so critically about so many important questions. So I don't know if I see my experience as necessarily a relatable or archetypal one, because it's pretty specific to just be a young person who has a family member who's in the spotlight, and then to have that kind of make certain aspects of your life more public. So I feel funny talking about it because I don't necessarily think it's something that I chose, nor something that is super helpful for a lot of people, because it's not something many people are going through. But I will say that what I've gotten out of it is really learning how important it is to surround myself with friendships and community where I have the chance to narrate my own experience and to be surrounded by people who let me narrate my own experience and to really like support my agency around that. Because most of the experience I've had being in the public eye hasn't been something that I chose. This is something I wanted to do. This is a cool thing I wanted to do with people that I respect and love, and that's something different. But I think I just consistently have to remind myself that the most important thing is that no matter and I think this applies to everyone, no matter what's being said about me, if the people who I surround myself with most closely are people who I trust to give me the space to grow and figure out who I am and how I want to narrate that, then that really makes me feel, I think, stronger and more able to deal with what comes my way.
That's really fascinating. I do think that there's a lot about controlling our own narratives that really, really matter, especially in this media landscape where things are often being said for us or on our behalfs. And actually, it's painted in such contrast to Connor, whose experience was very much a narrative that, you got to control because you got to, more or less. But I would love to hear what it's like coming out on YouTube and building your community around that and divulging that with your fans.
Yeah, no, totally. It was weird because I started YouTube about 6 years ago, and by no means did I plan for it to get as big as it did. So I had no intention of ever becoming as big as I am, but also ever coming out on YouTube. It just kind of happened along my journey. So at one point, because I accepted myself later on in life. I didn't accept my sexuality until I was like 21 years old, literally within like months of coming out. And I realized that I had such a big platform, and I realized that the reason I had accepted myself so quickly was because of that platform of people uploading videos to YouTube. That's kind of how I just found a connection through people, because in a small town in Minnesota, you don't see many queer people, or there aren't many queer people that speak up. So to me, it was in a weird way like queer people didn't exist around me. So to have that connection through YouTube videos, it really kind of helped me blossom, bloom like a flower, quicker than I think I would have otherwise. So when I realized that I wanted to make that video, I very much did it to inform everyone, but I also really did it to help all those people that followed me on YouTube, and to hopefully help some kid in a small town that was exactly like feeling exactly like I was, and give them a similar experience just by making that video. And I by no means did I expect it to get as big as it did. It definitely did really well, but I'm so thankful for that, because that means it helped more people, hopefully.
Was there ever any trepidation when you were making that decision to come out on YouTube? Because you, of course, are a social media personality, but also a business person by proxy, right? Was there any nervousness from you or from the people who helped to manage you that this would be bad for business?
No, actually, I never thought about it that way, and I think my team that I surround myself with, they're amazing people, so they never thought about it that way. So no, I never thought about it as like a brand decision or a business decision. I'm like, technically, I'm in the business of being myself. So with anything, it just further helps the narrative in a way.
I asked that question because we're going to talk about how being queer intersects, because all of you guys are artists and creators, right? So how has being queer informed your art and come out within each of your own art forms?
I mean, I think,
You don't want to go first?
I think right now one of the things that, so I'm a filmmaker, and the work that I'm doing is about putting people who have forever been in the background of films, if at all, to the foreground, right? So I'm specifically thinking about people who are Black, people who are femmes, people who are trans and disabled, people who are young. And for me, we're living in a moment in the US where violence is really heightened, right? Structural violence, and also interpersonal violence. Like this year already, so many Black trans women have been murdered, right? And I think about that as a Black trans woman who is trying to create life around Blackness and transness. And I think, we were talking a little bit about how it doesn't actually make my art any better to be navigating a lot of violence. But I think when we come together in spite of the many forms of violence that we're dealing with every day, that's really powerful, right? So I think as an artist, what is really powerful is when we're together making meaning and figuring out the world together, kind of like what we're doing right here, right? For people who a lot of times are told that we don't have a voice, that we don't matter. But when we come together, we get to feel our sense of power. And I think that, to me, is so compelling as an artist, and it allows me to be the kind of fullest, truest sense of who I actually am.
And you have a film coming out this summer, right?
Yeah, so the first film is The Personal Things. It's a short. It's with the legendary trans activist Miss Major. How many people are familiar with Miss Major? Cool, okay, some of us.
My hands in the back.
Yeah, some people in the back. That makes sense. So Miss Major is a Black elder. She's a Black trans woman who was one of the first people to fight back at the Stonewall riots of 1969. So a lot of what the LGBT movement's about kind of comes from many moments, but one of them was the Stonewall riots, where trans and gender nonconforming people were like, no, boo-boo, you're not going to police us, right? Like trans life is so regulated still, but in the 60s in New York, you weren't allowed to wear clothing that didn't match the gender you were assigned at birth. And so a lot of people like Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera and Miss Major really stood up in the summer of 1969 and said, this is not again. And they fought back against the police. And it's kind of really interesting to think about how much of our movement started against police violence, right? The LGBT movement starting around police violence. So The Personal Things is about Miss Major kind of speaking about how she's really doesn't care about respectability, right? She's like, I changed all of my ID back to male because I'm a trans person and I want people to love me for that, right? It's about her being the fullest expression of herself. And then the second one is Happy Birthday, Marsha, which Grace has a cameo in. Yeah, and it stars Maya Taylor, who was in this film Tangerine, and Maya Taylor plays Marsha P. Johnson in the hours leading up to the Stonewall riots, and I directed it with Sasha Wurzel.
I was thinking when you asked that question about art and identity and how identity informs art, I was remembering how, when I was younger, definitely when I was a teenager, and I kind of tried to imagine my future, it was like there were these set of options that had been laid out for me. And so maybe that had to do with identity, gender expression, sexuality, maybe it also had to do with, profession, like what am I gonna do when I grow up? Like what would it mean for me to do something that made me money and also meant I contributed to society, like these calculations of the kind of options that had been given to me. And more, the way that I try to make decisions isn't from looking at that sort of tray of options, but trying to go within and try to, and it's not easy, and I don't think I figured it out, but what would it mean to make choices and be guided by who I want to be? And then if I figure out who I want to be, how do I go places that support that? And how do I surround myself with people that support that, rather than picking some option and then being the person that that is expected to do that thing. And I don't think that's always possible, because there's so much that's preventing us from doing that, and we have to figure out all this stuff like how to make money and whether we want to continue to have relationships with our families if they don't accept us, and all of these things that sometimes push us to do things that don't feel good to us. But if I have this principle with my art and just with my life in general of trying to be guided to and by people and spaces that support a version of myself that I'm deciding, then that is really powerful.
Going off of that, similar thing is growing up, I felt like I was in such a bubble, and I felt like it was you had to do A, B, T equals C. So after coming out, I just realized that there was a whole endless world of possibilities, and I could be whoever I wanted to be, and I could do whatever I wanted to do. It's like after I got over that one big leap, I truly felt like I could do anything. And it just made me, in the sense of my art, it just made me realize that literally I could do anything, and I could wear anything, and I could be the personality I wanted to be, and I had no restrictions anymore. So in the sense of what it did to my art is it just made it anything infinitely possible, if that makes sense. And after that sense of acceptance, I think that's truly what opened that up for me.
as I've been watching you, over the past couple of years, I've noticed that, even just coming out, it seems like there was a kind of like a lift on, you seem to be more open with like what you speak about and what you're speaking on with your fans and how you're interacting with your fans. So has that allowed for more meaningful engagement with the people who are watching your videos and reaching out to you on social?
No, definitely. Again, it like opened up a whole new realm of authenticity, and it opened up different areas of my life that I could talk about, and like it just in the years afterwards about different things I could talk about. It's like I made up conversations about dating as I was in the closet, but it's like now I can really talk about dating boys, and I can really talk about my experience with being an openly gay male. So just like really kind of again further the narrative in my life.
When I was in high school, I was the only openly gay student in my high school, and so the football players called me Big Gay Phil. And I used to like laugh about it with them because I thought it was funny. And in retrospect, I realized how like absolutely messed up that was to be tokenized and to be like kind of relying on my homosexuality as like something that people identified me by. And we talk a lot about how, we've talked about queerness and how that helps you guys kind of inform your art and what message you're sending out in the world. And Grace, you already touched on this sort of, but is there that worry that, we're kind of queer first and then creators second, right? Like, do you ever worry about being pigeonholed in that regard?
I think it depends on what I'm trying to do and what world I'm trying to be in. There's so many different platforms to make your work on and share your art and do your activism. And just because more people read something or see something doesn't mean it's better than if you made a song that 3 or 4 of your friends listened to and really got something out of. Like scope and number of people isn't necessarily better or bigger or more important or more influential than something that fewer people are touched by but goes really deep into them. I mean, a lot of the art that I'm most impacted by is work by my closest friends, many of whom don't even share the work that they make. And that one thing they did for me or gave to me or showed me totally changed me and transformed me in a way that's something that a lot of people know about might not have the same effect, might not have that same impact. So I always try really hard with myself to be something doesn't have to be, big to be valuable. And it doesn't have to be known to be valuable. So it kind of depends what spaces I'm being in. With my closest friends, I try to surround myself with people who don't make me feel that way. But that also means that if I'm guided by that, maybe less people will see my work. So it's kind of it's this calculation of what do I have to sacrifice to go wider? And then what do I gain and how true do I get to be to myself when I stay a bit closer to home? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense.
I think about that a lot. Being more mainstream doesn't mean being impactful, and how thinking about, to just use the words that you were talking about, if I stay at home, it's smaller but it's meaningful. So flying into Austin is leaving home and it's navigating the TSA and their transphobia, right? It's all of these kinds of constant checks on myself, in order to be here today with everybody, right? And so I think it's important in these conversations to think about what are the things that we had to do to get us here right now, to be our biggest, fullest selves, right? And to have a kind of impact like this. And those things being really important to talk about, to acknowledge, because so many of us are having those experiences, right? So many of us are having really hurtful interactions with the police or with, the TSA or, so many other institutions, right? In order to do our work, in order to do really meaningful work. But I also think that part of what my purpose is to think about what are the everyday ways of resistance, the everyday ways of beauty that people who are not famous, people who, who are really marginalized are doing in order to change the world and make that really big. And I think to me, that's something that I'm really interested in doing.
Definitely. I think growing up, when I had always been afraid of that I would be that gay kid, because there was some weird stigma attached to it, or it felt like you would be individualized and kind of set aside in this category that you for some reason didn't want to be in. So I was always afraid to be that. But again, after coming out, I feel like I realized that I am that, and I want to embrace that, and I do want to be that. So I don't feel like it really restricts me or definitely doesn't offend me to like be in that category. But also, I want to amplify other parts of me, because again, it is just, you know, like a part of me. So I'm fine with that being maybe the first thing people talk about, but also I want to shed light on other aspects of my life.
And I think like too is like, is there more of a bind than straightness? Like straightness is such like a pit. You can like, you know, like straight culture, straight art is such a bind, right? It's like and it's so expansive. I think like queer life and queer art, especially like queer people of color, queer undocumented people, queer immigrants, queer people in prison. Like we have so many stories to tell that are only starting to get told, and it can feel really expansive.
I think something that does really hurt me though is when I'm spending so much time thinking about an issue or wrestling with a question, and then someone makes me feel like it's small. Yeah. That really, really makes me feel bad. And I don't know if that's the same as being pigeonholed, but you know, I've had a couple experiences in the past few months where, you know, I went into spaces where maybe most people were straight and cis, and talked about some of the work that I was doing, which, you know, often has to do with violence that trans and gender nonconforming people face. And I just realized in some one-on-one conversation, like, oh my God, you think this is small. Like, you think this is off to the side. You think this is elsewhere. You don't understand that this is actually about all of us. That as long as the people who you think are off to the side don't get to determine who they are and don't get to live safely, like, you can't be happy either. And I was like, why don't you want, it just, that really like gets me in my.
When you get in that situation, what do you tend to do? Do you tend to like calm yourself down and educate that person right off the bat, or does it kind of make you want to leave that scenario? What do you tend to do?
I feel like that's so hard, the balancing act of when is it my responsibility to try to like teach and support this person's growth, and when is it my responsibility to protect myself from something that's really hurtful. And I can't always do both. And sometimes I literally run for the hills. And sometimes I can calm myself down and have the patience to, you know, change the conversation in the direction of how has it felt for you to have to perform a certain type of womanhood? Like, does it feel easy to you to have to be a man? Is that something that's come easily to you? Do you feel sad when you feel like you're failing at that? I mean, I have my guesses about the answer. But I think that's such an important question. What do you guys think?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because, again, I come from an online space, and people's immediate reaction online is to attack, and they definitely don't like to educate. And I guess sometimes they like to run, but a lot of the times it's like someone says something incorrect, or someone just, again, says something wrong. They like to attack them and put them in their place and make them feel bad for saying it, and that always makes me feel strange because I'm like, I feel like you need to first educate people, so that's always the approach I take. But also, obviously, I realize that sometimes it's incredibly frustrating, and you just go off.
And I think that that's a good point, because in a lot of spaces, you know, it's certainly your duty as an ally to educate. But when you're the one being marginalized, it can be really hard to like climb up on a pedestal and have to be the bigger person every single time and turn the other cheek and educate. And I think that that's an important note for you guys in the audience. You know, if you are an ally to a queer person or gender nonconforming person, you hear hateful speech, you know, you have to be you often sometimes are going to have to rise to the occasion and be the one to bridge that gap and navigate those conversations with the people in your lives, whether they're saying that behind your friend's back or whether they're saying it online or to their face. You know, the onus does have to be on the allies as well as the community itself.
It's so exhausting to have to constantly explain yourself and say that you matter, right? It's so exhausting to have to constantly educate people about your own existence and why staying alive is important, right? And why like what you're doing to keep yourself alive is actually incredibly necessary.
So something that I think about a lot, particularly around this question with you know, the bathroom bills and also so much of the violence that is being faced by trans women, especially trans women of color, is that trans misogyny, you know, which is basically the idea that people who have femme identities, who perform femininity, regardless of what gender they're assigned at birth, experience heightened levels of violence. That's something that obviously deeply, deeply harms trans women, but it also deeply harms femme gender nonconforming people. It also deeply harms femme people who might, to many people in their lives be identified as cis gay men. Like, these binaries aren't very clear. And, you know, being a visibly gender nonconforming person, being somebody who doesn't fit into the category of a trans woman or a cis man, that's a site of intense violence too. And that this drive to identify ourselves with really clean categories often then ends up creating these new types of invisibility, these new types of erasure, where we lose the language to say, no, actually, like, I'm hurt by this too. I don't know if there's a clear conclusion there, except to say that I think, like, when we listen to the work and the ideas of people who have often been made invisible, everybody will learn new things about what they're going through also.
Well, you touched on the bathroom bills. I think it's probably important for us to, I mean, how many of you guys actually live here in Texas? Wow, okay.
I don't know why that was creepy. Just raise our hand.
So obviously, I'm sure that you guys have heard about Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick's bill, which is an immensely transphobic and dangerous bill that's preventing transgender people from using the bathrooms that correspond with their gender. And this legislation is extremely harmful. It mirrors legislation that we've seen in North Carolina. And so it's a huge concern and of imminent concern to our community right now. And I just wanted to have a moment for us to talk about what this kind of legislation means and how it affects people in our community, for those who might not understand.
I mean, I think it's deeply tied to how, well, one thing I should just say is that a lot of times when we go and we speak and we're on a stage, Grace and I, we're kind of seen as the experts, right? But I thought it was really powerful when everyone raised their hand, right? Because we're figuring out these answers together, right? Like, we're not coming from outside of Texas to say, like, this is what needs to happen in Texas. Actually, what's gonna be really powerful and the most impactful is local-based work, right? People who are here, who are currently navigating and who are directly impacted by this legislation and have for a really long time. So y'all have the answers, and we wanna be in support of y'all figuring it out and strategizing and working with other people who are directly impacted. And I think that's a really important thing, right? Because so often in this world, there are people who are deemed like the experts, and then there are people who like sit in the audience and like take notes and like, oh, this is what the experts say. And it's really meaningful to say, actually, my experience is my expertise, right? If I'm living in Texas and I'm navigating these laws, I'm an expert on what this means, right? And that is like really flips the kind of power dynamics of what's going on. And I think that's a really first important thing. So often young people, I feel like, I know when I was a young person, I was told I would have to wait until I was much older to be an expert about my life, right? And the people who had the expertise were my teachers or my coaches or like the people who were at the church I went to, right? Or my parents. So I think it's just so deeply important in this moment right now when violence is increasing and we're constantly being told that we don't have a voice, to know that if we're dealing with an issue, we're the experts and people should be listening to us about it. So I think that's like the first just like blanket statement that we want to make, that Grace and I like often like, really try to say. And then the other is, just like supporting local-based work, right? I'm based in New York, so when I come to a place to speak or to do work, I always try to figure out who are the people who are navigating these kinds of laws and systems. How can I be in service of that work? And one of the groups that I use to figure that out is the Trans Justice Funding Project. And so how many people are familiar with Trans Justice Funding Project? Cool, okay, great.
Whoa,
yeah, that's
so
great.
cool.
That's really cool. So the Trans Justice Funding Project funds small local-based organizing and small local-based support work all throughout the U.S. And I often look at their website, which is just Trans Justice Funding Project, to figure out what's the work happening in the place. So in Texas, it's Alago, it's Black Trans Women Inc. It's a lot of organizations that have been doing it for a really long time. And I think one of the issues that I'm having right now in this moment where resistance is getting more valuable, right, in a kind of money-based way and more popular in a kind of internet shareable way, that a lot of times the people who have been resisting for a really long time are pushed to the background, right? A lot of times the people who are really dealing with the most are pushed to the background. This is a moment where it's really important to not do that. To say the people who have been resisting these things for years and years and years before it got popular, before it got like many likes on Facebook, are the people we need to be listening to right now. So I think that to me is the first part of this conversation.
I do wonder, there was that moment a couple of weeks ago where Laverne Cox was on television, on CNN, I think it was. And there was a transphobic commentator there who was saying basically that, these bathroom bills should be law, they're protecting families, et cetera, kind of fueling this rhetoric that, the right has really mobilized. And Laverne basically asked the commentator, well, do you think that I should go to the men's room then? And he didn't really have much to say. So I do wonder about the reality of do people actually realize what this will mean if transgender people are forced into using the bathroom that corresponds with their birth certificate? What is that going to actually mean for endangering someone's life?
I mean, I think what's going on is that the people with power who are making these decisions and pushing for these bills, they are so afraid. They're afraid of you. They're afraid of you all because you're so powerful, and just the choices that you're making about how you dress and changing your name and choosing your pronoun and who you love and what you do with your friends cast everything into question about the ways that they've lived their lives. And that is so scary. And sometimes when people are afraid, they have no idea what to do except abuse their power. I really think there's a clear correlation between those things. And so I just look at someone like that guy, and I'm just like, oh my God, dude, you are terrified. Because just the simple choice of someone saying, I don't want to choose between two rooms and say that one of those rooms is who I am, like just the actual deep preposterousness of being born into the world and told that there are only two options for what you can be and you have to be one of them. It's like if someone told you the moon was made of cheese. It doesn't even make sense. It's like so outrageous, And I think that what seem to us like these simple choices that just have to do with like our day-to-day life and getting to decide who we are and how we live make people who are really stuck and really trapped have to question everything. And I don't know if what that says for how we resist it and how we push against it. I think what Reina said is completely true. Like the answer is going to come from you all and is going to come from the people who have been fighting against this stuff for a long time. But I do think that it has to do with power and people being afraid of the internal power of people who are asking the most profound questions.
Definitely. And I think all of that shows just how misguided and misinformed people are. I think that interviewer it's crazy to me that he didn't even think of that possibility. It shows that he just saw what he thought it was and didn't look into it. So one of the ways that I think each one of you guys and everyone can do to help prevent that from happening is to inform the people in your direct circles. I know I had a little story time. I had my family came to visit me in California like 6 months ago or something. It was my parents and my brother, and I don't know why I got the idea, but one morning I was like, okay, we're gonna have the A to Z of LGBTQ+. I literally sat them down and was like, I went through like some website and read a word aloud and explained it to them or see if they knew what it was. And it really helped open a dialogue in my family. And I come from a place of great privilege in that sense that like I can have that conversation with my family, but it was also something I never thought I would do or ever thought that they would be receptive towards. And they really opened up to it. My dad he's a doctor, and he calls me up with LGBT questions pretty frequently now. And it's just opened that dialogue, and it like warms my heart that he feels like he can come to me in that sense. So I think if you feel comfortable doing that, reach out to even just one person in your friend circle or your family or your school and inform them. I think that type of exposure is really contagious and can really help spread. Yeah. So you again, it all roots to that you guys have the power.
On the same topic, I think one of the most effective ways of protest is people have been talking about using your wallet as a form of protest and encouraging your families to use their wallets as a form of protest. And as, I was gearing up for South by Southwest, I realized, we're coming and flying into Texas and supporting a tourism industry in a state that's, actively trying to pass legislation that's marginalizing the trans community and discriminating against the trans community. So kind of to counter that, I think by spreading message and being here, we are doing good, but it's not something that didn't cross my mind, and I'm sure not something that didn't cross your minds either.
Yeah, I mean, I think every space that we enter into, every institution we deal with, every single time someone, offers to like support you or give you some money, or you want to buy clothes from them. There's all of this stuff we have to deal with. It's really hard to make totally ethical choices. There's been controversy with South by Southwest leading up to this event, because there were a lot of people who were really upset about the festival's former policy of threatening to deport undocumented bands and music groups if they played, off-site shows or unscheduled shows. But in the week leading up to this, tons of people who were scheduled to come play the festival mobilized, started an online petition, really pushed the festival, and in the final minutes, the festival changed the policy. So that's really amazing, and that was entirely organized by bands and musicians that were supposed to be playing here. But it's pretty, was there some applause in the audience? But I think it's pretty hard to find spaces to be in and things to do that are totally without fault and totally pure. And that's not really any one person's fault. That's just the system that we're living in, and speaks to how difficult it is for everyone to navigate it in a way that's safe for themselves, let alone other people.
Well, I would love for you to talk about your organization, because you're crowdfunding, right? And that's a big part of your purpose.
So the organization that I started an organization with two close friends that's we're almost done building. It's a crowdfunding platform called support.fm. And it's a crowdfunding platform to specifically raise money for bail and bond to help get trans and gender nonconforming people out of jail and detention. So, existing crowdfunding platforms like Kickstarter, GoFundMe, YouCaring, maybe stuff you've seen because friends or family have used them, they have rules in their terms of use against people using those platforms for bail money. So obviously just the very fact of them disallowing the fundraising of bail money says a lot about how people see people who have been in jail or prison and detention, because that's, people who have been through the criminal justice system are often seen as less valuable than other people in a really simple way. And I think it's really important to push back against that, and to push back against a lot of our biases and ideas about people who have supposedly committed crimes or been in prisons, when in fact, I think we all know that the reason that people usually end up in jails or prison and detention isn't because they're bad people, but because they're dealing with a lot of barriers, and there's a lot of stuff getting in the way of them surviving and of their community surviving. And that obviously really impacts trans and gender nonconforming people who are in prisons at rates much higher than the rest of the population, especially trans people of color. So we started this organization as a way of saying, if you have money to give, if your family or your friends have disposable income, have a few extra dollars that you want to give to an organization, it's not just valuable to give that money to a large organization to pay for the cost of overhead and operations. Even if nonprofits are doing amazing work, it's just as important to actually invest in a person's freedom. That it's just as valuable to say, I'm going to use my money to make sure that this person who's my age doesn't have to spend 2 or 3 years of their life in jail in a really unsafe context. So we started this to kind of create a structure for people to move their money directly to those in the LGBTQ community who are often facing the most barriers and facing the most violence.
I love that. Congratulations to you, because that's some really incredible work, and it also speaks to pre-hearing bail, and how that's, very much skewed towards economically privileged people in the system, and how unfortunate that is. I do want to open it up to a Q&A. I do have one more question before we do so, though. I have a couple of family members who voted for Donald Trump, and one of the things that I always get on when I post something on Facebook or Twitter from them is, I get a text message usually that's like, oh, don't worry, Donald Trump is going to leave the gays alone. Don't worry about it. He's from New York. He likes gays, so it'll be fine. And obviously, there are so many problematic things with that statement, and with my family in general. But there is this notion, right, that that people do not consider the LGBTQ community to be in imminent danger with the Donald Trump presidency. What would you say to those people?
I mean, I think that it's really, as we all know, that queer and trans and gender nonconforming people are Muslims. Queer and trans and gender nonconforming people are Black. Queer and trans and gender nonconforming people are navigating borders. Queer and trans and gender nonconforming people need health care. Queer and trans and gender nonconforming people are young people. Queer and trans and gender nonconforming people are people in prison, right? it's so important and it's so meaningful to make sure that the erasure of the most marginalized parts of the LGBTQ gender nonconforming community are in this moment at the center, right? Like that's gonna make our resistance really powerful. And the moment that we stop doing that, I think we're really doing a great, for lack of a better word, disservice for fighting the violences of this moment.
Did you want to say anything?
You go for it.
Okay.
I'll jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is also really related to your question about how can white gay men be a part of, supporting the movements of those who are facing the most violence. Because as Reina said, I think this thing, I remember seeing people sort of, the week that we found out that Ivanka had encouraged Donald, not, I don't know why I'm on a first name basis with them, had encouraged Donald not to sign an executive order. Allegedly, Ivanka is to thank for the decision not to sign an anti-LGBTQ executive order. And people were celebrating this as if it was some kind of accomplishment when every single executive order leading up to that is going to have outsized impact on LGBTQ people. He had already signed anti-LGBTQ executive orders, And so it's all about breaking down these barriers between who we think people are. And as Reina said, recognizing that when people are celebrating the fact that an anti-LGBTQ order wasn't signed, the truth is that that's just going to continue to keep safe the members of the LGBTQ community who are already the safest. Honestly, most white cis people with class privilege who identify as gay aren't dealing with employment discrimination or an inability to find housing the way that trans and GNC people of color are. And more in LGBTQ movements, we're facing this really difficult question, which is, are we really dealing with the same stuff? Or have a group of us who benefit from things that people in our society have always benefited from, namely being white, having money, being able-bodied. What are we really fighting for? If those people are already safe, is that still where we need to be focusing our efforts? Is that still the protection that we need to be fighting for? And I think that's these are just questions that we need to be asking ourselves all the time. I also try to think about, every space I go into, I think about every single person that I love and how they would feel if they were in that room with me. And I think about what I can do to carry them with me in every context, and what are the small ways I can make that context just that much more hospitable.